My name is Shannon Phillips. I'm here to talk today about our ideas, about our values, about activism, about what it means to be a left-wing feminist in Alberta, about tenacity and leadership, and as an element of leadership. A bit about me. I work for the Alberta Federation of Labour, where I do policy and research and work with the media on issues that matter to 145,000 working Albertans. This year, the AFL is celebrating its centennial. The Voice of Working Albertans was actually founded here in Lethbridge in 1912. I am also the volunteer chair of Women's Space Resource Centre here in Lethbridge, where I and a small group of other dedicated volunteers and staff ensure there is a feminist voice in our community. Now, in my experience, the only way to get to a leadership role in my version of politics is to first and foremost be tenacious. If you steel your resolve, leadership roles accrue to you as a matter of default. And the best way to make sure you can keep going is if you stop being what people think of as a leader. This means sharing out leadership roles to others. It means building up people around you, giving them the chance to shine, and teaching your skills to everyone who is willing to learn, especially young people. I have yet to find any other way to keep going. I am what they call a social democrat in Alberta. I work for the labour movement, and I'm a feminist. I have worked for the NDP. This is your cue to scoff and ask me what I'm doing still living in this province. I want to talk a little bit about that reaction. I know some of you just had it. I'm going to challenge it. Now, I would hazard a guess that most of the people in this room hold the same values as I do. In fact, decades of public opinion polls of Albertans show massive support for universal health care, equality, protecting the environment, public education. And so on those grounds alone, I quibble with this notion that my values are outside the norm of what most people in this province think or believe. In fact, I think we're all pretty united in some key views, such as this one. There are some services that do not make good candidates for the profit motive. For example, making a profit off the sick, or making a profit off assisting the elderly, or making a profit off caring for people living with mental illness. Those are not activities consistent with most Canadian values. Those are the values that underlie a vibrant public sector, and they are the values that built some of the most productive, advanced countries in the world, with the highest standards of living. In most of the industrialized world, it has been understood that a decent and public social safety net is precisely what makes the private market economy function in an orderly fashion. Those are the lessons that advanced industrialized countries learned after the Great Depression. But what we see now is the opposite. Over the past 30 years, Canada has decreased its social investments to new lows. We have at the same time increased inequality to the point where Canadian wealth is as concentrated in as few hands as it has been since the Great Depression. We have the highest levels of poverty since the Great Depression. So part of being creative in one's leadership is to establish common ground on our shared values, and then use those connections as a springboard to action. But there is sometimes something in the way of action. Many people acknowledge that broadly we share social democratic values. They are, after all, Canadian values. But there's a profound defeatism when it comes time to doing the work of getting them back into our public policy after 3 decades of unraveling them out. This is why I titled this talk, Optimism of the Will and Pessimism of the Intellect. That is a quote from Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian socialist leader and thinker who died in prison. He was jailed by Mussolini's fascists in the 1930s. In philosophy, that phrase of Gramsci's is often interpreted to mean that we as human beings can be both optimistic and pessimistic at the same time, and we are able to move forward while holding those same two views. But many might take the pessimism of the intellect portion of that quote to mean that it is smart to be pessimistic, and take a further leap to a place where we imagine ourselves to be more clever than the optimists because we take the negative view. In modern times, this kind of hipster affliction positions caring about anything as uncool. Therefore, the smart way to be is aloof, negative, defeatist, because you will never be disappointed. Let us disabuse ourselves of those notions. First, this kind of thinking is not clever unless to you clever means the same thing as lazy. It is not a way to undermine the status quo. It is a way to perpetuate it. It is not a way to reject the way things are. It is a free pass to all those in power who would have you sit down, shut up, and keep shopping. Values like diversity, equality, or environmental sustainability must be articulated if they are to persist. Without ongoing expression through action, our social democratic values are subordinated to other values, like greed. And so if I have one message to my irony-saturated generation, it is this. You may fancy yourself too smart to care, but the forces of greed, inequality, or militarism depend on your silence. And so you have a choice to make. If you do nothing, you are implicating, not exempting yourself. Inaction is action. This too cool for school of thought, this idea that only very silly people even bother trying, also asks us to buy into instant gratification. You all know the argument, I'm sure we've all heard it. Oh, I signed a petition once, but the government went ahead and did whatever it wanted anyway, so it's no use in even trying. Because I was not instantly rewarded. This mindset is, in my opinion, based on a spoiled child view of the world, that we are always entitled to get what we want, and we ought to be praised for success at every turn. About 10 years ago, I was in my mid-20s and beginning to get a little tired of failure as a left-wing girl in Alberta. I was tired of losing. I was tired of being part of the same organizations, saying the same things to the same people, all over and over again with little chance of success. Just at that time, I had the great privilege to do a radio interview with Noam Chomsky, one of the greatest thinkers of the last century. I was a wide-eyed student at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, grad student. And of course, I asked him one of the most hackneyed, ridiculous, predictable questions one can ever ask a public intellectual. How is it, I asked him, that you can keep going after 50 years? Our side always seems to be on the losing end. That was on the eve of the illegal US invasion of Iraq, and I had just participated in the largest demonstrations in Alberta's history on the steps of the legislature with 20,000 other people. But Chomsky said something I will never forget. He said, in the United States, they had just had larger demonstrations against the invasion of Iraq than they ever had against the war in Vietnam. He added that people expect to see immediate change when we do one thing, like attend a rally. Not just young people, but older people too. Impatience is not exclusively an infirmity of the young. And if you expect your one action to lead to one success in neat mathematical fashion, you are doing battle with reality. There is no final score. What I took from Chomsky's answer was that none of this is a game. Democracy, public service, advocacy, agitation, organization, community building, these are ongoing jobs. They are like housework. You cannot ever finish them, but they must be done. The American invasion and occupation of Iraq is an instructive case study, I think. Speaking out against it was formative for me because I was in my mid-20s and just starting my career in politics. A decade ago, we were organizing, we were protesting, we were arguing against the outright lies perpetuated by the politicians and the media about weapons of mass destruction. We were objects of derision. We were ridiculed and scorned. Our own provincial government here in Alberta, enthusiastically endorsed and supported that war. And remember, too, that the millions worldwide who spoke out against that war were not successful. The Americans did it anyway. 650,000 Iraqis died as a result of that war, the population of the city of Winnipeg. There are 5 million orphaned children in Iraq, which is equal to orphaning every single child in Canada under 14. By those standards, we were catastrophic failures. Us with our pathetic little placards and our fits of protest here in Canada. But our country, because of mass public protest, and despite what this provincial government wanted, did not send troops into that war. And what a difference a decade makes. Our arguments were right, and almost every commentator, expert, or person with a smidgen of moral compass on either the right or the left of the political spectrum now agrees with us. And so we did not technically win, but we did something significant. Keep that in mind the next time you see a mass protest, whether it's occupying Wall Street or exercising civil disobedience to stop the Northern Gateway pipeline from Alberta's oil sands to the BC coast. I expect you will see that kind of civil disobedience from British Columbia's First Nations and assorted environmental groups over the coming months and years. Ask yourself whether the people who are being maligned are being so because it serves someone's agenda, and whether the seeming one-off of a protest is actually part of something much larger, an articulation of a worldview, a set of values, or a vision of the future. Ask yourself whether those larger value statements about justice or the environment, equality or peace, are views that you also share. I do want to also share with you a local case study about the expression of values. When Women's Based Resource Centre here in Lethbridge lost our federal funding for financial literacy programs for low-income women, I went to Ottawa to testify before the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women. At that committee, I made many compelling arguments as to why our funding should remain. I indicated that on a budget of $150,000, we served over 850 low-income women teaching financial literacy skills. On an MP's annual salary, we served 1% of the population of Lethbridge in the course of a year and a half. When I got back to Lethbridge, people said, "Oh, you did a good job of telling them how important women's space is. For sure you'll have your funding reinstated." It was all I could do not to laugh. Because this is actually not about who has the best arguments. Of course, our funding was not reinstated because we are an explicitly feminist organization who have done feminist advocacy for over the course of our 25 years. It does not matter our value to this community or the kinds of services we give to low-income women. It does not matter that our services probably save money for government in the long run. What matters is that our values clash with those of the current government. And so we have had to be creative. We have had to keep going in the face of great odds and fewer resources. We are actually in a pitched battle over values. It is, I believe, the greatest challenge to our generation and has as its foundation the existential question of what Canada is and whose interests we put first. It is, however, a time-limited conversation. I have not yet mentioned the coming climate crisis, but it is upon us, and how we organize human affairs in response to it could potentially contribute to greater equality and a different, even greener economy. But if we continue to do nothing, as we have, the time is running out. The more likely scenario is the unpredictability wreaked by climate change will undercut our efforts at making a better world. Our current standard of living is unlikely to persist, at least for the majority of us in the West. But there is nothing else to do except keep going. And so if you take up the challenge to defend our shared values, and if you keep going in the face of great odds, you will exercise creative muscles you never knew you had. You will fight and fight and fight and lose. You will learn that the foundational concepts of democracy, sustainability, equality, those are an ongoing experiment. They have many outstanding questions and very few resolutions. And at the end of your long days, you will go home, you'll do the dishes, and you'll think of your work as an activist, like housework. It needs to be done, but it is never done. I want to leave you with a quote from Tommy Douglas, who was the founding leader of Canada's New Democratic Party. You say the little efforts I make will never tip the scales where justice hangs in the balance. I don't think I ever thought they would. But I am prejudiced beyond debate in favor of which side will fill the stubborn ounces of my weight.